Thanksgiving morning began like any other, a chill in the air, the faint aroma of Olivia's pumpkin pie wafting through our cozy little house. But as the frost melted off the rooftops, flashing red and blue lights bathed the neighborhood in a surreal glow. I should have stayed inside. I should have ignored it like I always do. But something about that day felt wrong. And by the end of the week, I would wish I had never stepped outside. It all began with a smell. Not your usual garbage on a hot day kind of stink, but something worse. Sweet and putrid, like rotting fruit mixed with raw meat. It clung to the back of your throat, making you gag every time you tried to breathe. Olivia, my wife, was the first to notice. Maybe raccoons got into the bins again, she muttered, pulling the curtains aside to peer at the commotion 2 doors down. The house belonged to Mr. Elliot. Quiet, wiry, and forgettable. Strange guy, Olivia had always said, though no one really knew much about him. He lived alone ever since his wife vanished years ago. Rumors swirled, as they do in small neighborhoods, but no one dared to ask questions. That evening the police were still at his house, flashlights darting across the yard like fireflies. Olivia peeked from behind the blinds, her face pale as a sheet. Then the coroner's van pulled up. "He's dead," she whispered. By the time the turkey was in the oven, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Speculation spread like wildfire. "It wasn't just a death," Olivia hissed, holding her phone like a lifeline. "It was a murder." The details trickled in. Mr. Elliot's body had been found in his recliner, his throat slashed ear to ear. Above him, smeared in what looked like blood, was a jagged spiral symbol carved into the wall. I tried to shrug it off. Sure, it was unsettling, but it was over, right? Except I couldn't stop thinking about 2 weeks earlier. I'd taken the trash out late one night and noticed his porch light flickering, not random but in a deliberate rhythm. On, off, pause. It was almost like Morse code. I'd laughed about it at the time, but now the memory made my skin crawl. The next morning, Detective Hart arrived. She was tall, sharp-eyed, and no-nonsense, the kind of person who looked like she didn't believe in small talk. The way her gaze lingered on the empty lots at the edge of the cul-de-sac sent a shiver down my spine. Days turned into a blur of police activity and whispered conversations. Detective Hart wasn't just investigating a murder. She was unraveling something far more sinister. Word got out that Mr. Elliot had a history, a violent one, assault charges in his 20s, a stint in a psychiatric hospital, and whispers of involvement in a secretive underground cult. And then there was the journal, pages upon pages of paranoid scribbles, warnings, and strange symbols. In the middle of it all was the same spiral that had been smeared on his wall. According to Hart, Elliot had fled the cult years ago, but they hadn't forgotten him. By Thanksgiving night, the festive cheer had been replaced with fear. Families locked their doors, the streets were eerily quiet, and even Olivia stayed off her group chats. But something was brewing. I felt it in the air, like the weight of an approaching storm. It was past midnight when I saw the van. White, nondescript, and crawling down the street like a predator stalking prey. It paused in front of Elliot's house, and 3 men stepped out. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by caps and scarves. Without hesitation, they slipped into Elliot's backyard. Olivia grabbed my arm as I reached for my coat. "Don't you dare." "I'll just look," I whispered, though my heart was already hammering. I crept around the side of the house, staying low. Through the kitchen window, I saw them. The men were gathered in the living room, standing in a circle. One of them knelt in the center, arranging something on the floor, a photograph maybe. They spoke in low, guttural tones, the language unfamiliar and sharp. Then they lit it on fire. The flames roared to life, unnaturally bright, casting shadows that twisted and writhed. Those shadows weren't normal. They moved with intent, forming jagged spirals and grotesque shapes that made my stomach churn. I stumbled back, my foot snapping a branch underfoot. The nearest man whipped his head toward the sound, his eyes locking onto mine. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the house. Olivia yanked the door open, her face white with terror as I scrambled inside. We locked every door and window, clutching kitchen knives as we huddled in the dark. Hours passed, each second stretching into an eternity, but the van never returned. By morning, the men were gone. The police found no evidence of a break-in. Detective Hart vanished soon after, transferred or resigned, no one seemed to know. And Mr. Elliott's murder, it remains unsolved. Sometimes late at night I think about the journal, the spirals on the walls, the way those men moved, their ritual casting impossible shadows. And I wonder if they'll come back, or if they ever really left. The smell of burnt turkey always takes me back to that night. Not the feast, not the family drama, but the shadows that moved when they shouldn't have. For years, Thanksgiving had been less of a celebration and more of a ritual of survival. Not because of the food or the guests, but because of him. James was the storm that never calmed, a volatile force lurking in every room of the house. This year, though, I thought I'd found my way out, a chance to break free from 10 years of fear, bruises, and the suffocating weight of his anger. I thought I'd planned for everything, but nothing could have prepared me for the darkness waiting on the other side of the door. The day started as they always did with James, barking orders from his throne on the couch. The flickering light of the football game reflected off the beer cans scattered around him. "Gravy better not be lumpy this year," he grumbled, not even looking up. "And don't overcook the turkey like you always do." "Yes, James," I muttered, keeping my tone flat. Inside, I counted down the hours. One more day, I told myself. One more day of biting my tongue, enduring his barbed words and threats. By tonight, I'd be gone. In the garage, hidden behind old paint cans, was my suitcase. Inside it were my clothes, the small stash of cash I'd managed to hide, and a prepaid burner phone with just enough minutes to call for help once I was far enough away. I had memorized every step, when he'd pass out drunk, when the house would be quiet, and how I'd slip into the night unnoticed. I'd planned for everything, except for the knock at the door. It was late afternoon when it happened. The soft rapping echoed through the house, out of place against the background noise of the football game. My heart skipped, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. Visitors were rare, especially uninvited ones. James grunted, annoyed. "Who the hell is that?" I peeked through the curtain and saw a man standing on the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a heavy coat that seemed unnecessary for the mild weather. His face was unreadable, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his baseball cap. "Can I help you?" I asked hesitantly when I opened the door. "Car broke down," he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Phone's dead. Mind if I use yours?" Something about him felt wrong. His tone, his posture, everything about him made my stomach churn. Before I could respond, James stomped to the door. "Who is it?" he barked. I stepped aside. "He says his car broke down." James looked the man up and down, suspicion etched into his face. "Where's your car?" The man hesitated, just for a moment. "A couple streets over," he said finally. "Didn't think anyone was home at the other houses." James didn't buy it. Crossing his arms, he sneered. "Yeah, well, we don't have a phone. You're out of luck." The man's eyes flicked to me for the briefest moment before he nodded and walked away. I watched him disappear down the street, unease curling in my gut. "Creeps like that. You don't let them in," James growled, grabbing another beer, probably casing the place, looking for an easy mark. By the time dinner rolled around, the tension in the house was suffocating. I focused on the simple tasks, carving the turkey, setting the table, all while fighting the growing sense of dread that something wasn't right. And then, as I laid the last dish on the table, I saw it. Movement. A shadow flickered just outside the window. "James," I whispered, my voice trembling. There's someone outside. He slammed his beer down and stalked to the window, yanking the curtain aside. I don't see anything, he snapped. I swear I saw… Enough! His voice boomed through the room, making me flinch. You're just looking for excuses to ruin dinner. Sit down. I obeyed, my hands trembling as I picked up my fork. We were halfway through the meal when the living room window shattered. The sound was deafening, a sharp, explosive crash that made me scream. James shot to his feet, knocking his chair over in the process. What the hell? He shouted, but before either of us could react, they were inside. 3 men in ski masks, their dark clothing blending with the shadows. One of them pointed a gun at James. Sit down, the man ordered, his voice cold and commanding. James hesitated for a moment before raising his hands and slowly lowering himself back into his chair. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Take whatever you want, James stammered, his bravado crumbling. We don't have much, but it's yours. The man with the gun chuckled darkly. We're not here for your money. The leader of the group, a tall man with a menacing presence, dragged a chair from the corner of the room and sat down across from James. We know who you are, he said, his voice calm but dripping with malice. James stiffened. I don't know what you're talking about. The man leaned forward, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Sure you do. You think you can screw people over and walk away, think no one's going to come knocking? I glanced at James, confused and terrified. He avoided my eyes, his jaw tight. What do you want? James asked, his voice trembling. Payback, the man said simply. As they argued, I saw my chance. One of the men had his back to me, distracted. Slowly, I reached for the carving knife on the table, my fingers wrapping around the handle. The leader must have noticed. His dark eyes flicked to me, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. What about her? He asked, tilting his head toward me. Does she know what kind of man she's married to? James's face twisted with rage, and for a moment I thought he'd turn on me instead of them. She doesn't know anything, he spat. The man laughed softly. That's what I thought. I didn't wait to hear what he would say next. With every ounce of strength I had, I lunged, driving the knife into the side of the nearest man. The room erupted into chaos. James tackled the leader, and I scrambled to grab the gun the injured man had dropped. Another man lunged at me, but I fired a shot before he could reach me. The sound was deafening, the recoil sending a shock through my arms. The fight was a blur of screams, blood, and desperate movements. When it was over, 2 of the intruders lay motionless on the floor. The third had fled, leaving a trail of blood behind him. James slumped against the wall, clutching his shoulder where a knife had grazed him. You saved me, he said, his voice filled with disbelief. I stared at him, the gun still trembling in my hands. No, I said quietly. I saved myself. I didn't wait for him to recover. While he was still dazed, I grabbed my suitcase, my keys, and the burner phone. Where are you going? He called after me, his voice weak, but I didn't answer. I drove through the night, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. For the first time in a decade, I felt free. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the shadows of that night are still following me, and I wonder if they ever really left. Thanksgiving is supposed to be a time for gratitude and family. But for some families, it's not about giving thanks. It's about surviving the gathering. For us, Thanksgiving wasn't a celebration. It was a battlefield. This one, though, was destined to be different. It was Grandma's last. Cancer had taken its toll, leaving her frail and barely clinging to her voice. She had one final wish, to see her family together under one roof. And no matter the tension that simmered between us, we all owed her that. The moment Uncle Dennis walked through the door, I knew this wasn't going to be the heartfelt goodbye she dreamed of. What none of us realized was how far things would spiral, how the darkness in one person's heart could pull the rest of us into the abyss. The house felt strange from the moment we arrived. Maybe it was the way the curtains were drawn tight against the daylight, leaving the living room cloaked in shadows. Or maybe it was the heavy silence that hung in the air, pressing on our chests like a weight. Dad parked the car, but none of us moved to get out. Mom stared at the house, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. "He's here, isn't he?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Dad sighed. "Mom wanted him here, Helen. What were we supposed to do, say no to a dying woman?" Mom didn't reply. Instead, she opened the car door, her movements stiff, like she was bracing herself for a storm. Inside, the house buzzed with low, uneasy energy. Aunt Linda was in the kitchen, muttering under her breath as she stabbed at the green bean casserole. Cousin Sarah sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a blank expression. No one was really talking, just stealing glances at the dining room, where Dennis sat at the far end of the table. I hadn't seen him in years. He looked thinner now, meaner. His face was lined with bitterness, and his eyes scanned the room like a predator sizing up prey. The last time Dennis had been here, the fight was so bad Grandma told him never to come back. Even as a kid, I remembered the yelling, the fear in everyone's eyes. Now he was back, and he didn't look like a man seeking forgiveness. When dinner started, the tension at the table was suffocating. Grandma sat at the head, her oxygen tank hissing softly as she tried to speak above the silence. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice barely audible. "It means the world to me." We murmured polite replies, but the air felt heavy, like we were all holding our breath. Dennis sat quietly for most of the meal, cutting his turkey with slow, deliberate movements. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "who wants to start?" The room froze. "Start what?" Dad asked, his voice wary. Dennis smirked. "The confessions. Isn't that what family dinners are for? Clearing the air?" No one said a word. Grandma looked down at her plate, her hands trembling. Dennis turned his attention to Aunt Linda first. "How about you, Linda? Still sneaking off to see your high school boyfriend? Or did Frank finally figure it out?" Linda's face turned ashen. "Shut up, Dennis," she hissed. "Oh, come on," Dennis said, laughing. "We're all family here. No secrets, right?" "Stop it," Grandma said weakly, her voice trembling. But Dennis wasn't done. He turned to Sarah next. "And you, Sarah, how's the baby? Oh, wait, that's right. You didn't keep it, did you?" Sarah's chair scraped against the floor as she stood, tears streaming down her face. "You're a monster," she whispered before running out of the room. Dennis chuckled darkly. "See, this is what happens when you bury things. They rot. Enough." Dad slammed his fist on the table, his voice booming. Dennis didn't flinch. He turned to Dad, his smirk widening. "Oh, Jim, you're the last person who should be taking the moral high ground. Want to tell Helen about the little indiscretion with your secretary, or should I?" The room erupted. Dad lunged across the table, knocking over a wine glass as he grabbed Dennis by the collar. Mom was shouting, Linda was crying, and in the chaos, no one noticed Grandma struggling to breathe. Her wheezing silenced the room. We rushed to her side, adjusting her oxygen mask as she clutched the edges of her wheelchair. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stop this." For a moment, everyone froze. Even Dennis seemed to feel a flicker of shame. But then Grandma said something that changed everything. "It's my fault," she said, her voice breaking. We all stared at her. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Dad asked gently. Grandma's hands trembled as she gripped the wheelchair tighter. "I let him come back," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "After what he did, I thought he'd changed." Dennis's smirk vanished, his face twisted with anger. "Don't," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. But Grandma kept going. "Your cousin Alex," she said, her voice breaking. The night he disappeared. It was Dennis. The room went cold. What are you talking about? Dad's voice shook. Grandma closed her eyes. He hurt Alex. I didn't know at first, but when I found out, I couldn't let him go to jail. He was my son. You're lying, Dennis shouted, standing so fast his chair toppled over. No, Grandma said, her voice steady now. I'm not. Dennis lunged at her, but Dad intercepted him, slamming him against the wall. Plates shattered, chairs fell, and the house erupted into chaos. Call the police, Mom shouted, her voice breaking. Dennis fought like a wild animal, but Dad held him down. You killed him, didn't you? Dad roared, his voice filled with rage. Dennis didn't answer. Instead, he laughed. A cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. The police arrived soon after, dragging Dennis out of the house as he screamed that we were all liars, that we'd never prove anything. Grandma passed away 3 days later. The family never recovered. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that Thanksgiving, about the way Dennis's laugh echoed through the house, about the secrets that had festered for years, finally brought to light. They say family is forever, but some scars run too deep to heal. Some things can never be forgiven.